I'm so tired. I'm getting tired. My kids have just not too many meals this week. I'm sure nobody will die. Yeah, Mum's just going to have a little siesta in the car. Just tap on the car. Don't go over 500. We're going to get a good number.
That's why you have to check.
You see?
Oh yeah. Chippy didn't to organise.
There had to be a reason.
I think everyone's here.
Yeah, I think we can start. We'll just close the doors, Ronnie, because the noise falls.
Oh yeah. I know.
Right.
Yeah, no, I've got him. I'll take the print off. It's like that, and that's all the wire things, and it's going to solve the handle.
Good day, everyone.
Yeah.
Pleasure for me to be back in Johannesburg and again to interact with CSA Gauteng. Been out of South Africa now for 8 years. My second visit back in that time. Coming back to see a lot of good stuff and some sad stuff as well in the country that we miss. But having said that, I am quite comfortable in Canada. I miss the sunshine. We have very long winters. They last about 4 months and very cold. The lecture that I'm presenting is not only dedicated to CSA Gauteng, it's one that I'm also presenting and have presented elsewhere. And it's from an academic point of view, how as a ceramics art historian we approach what you do. And after the lecture, and some of the stuff you're going to be very familiar with, but I'm presenting it as though you actually don't know anything about ceramics. And this is to illustrate how, from an academic point of view, we can explore a theme. And afterwards I'll talk to you again about the absolute necessity that you create texts as foundations to support your work, so that academics, not only me and the others, the next generation of academics will have something that they can actually study. So bear with me if anything of this is familiar to you. The lecture is titled Cultural Referencing as a Feature of the Contextual History of 20th and 21st Century South African Ceramics. This will be familiar to you. So on a timeline of those 2 centuries, South African traditional pottery has a continuous presence, whether in a strict cultural idiom or in adapted expressions. Then we have semi-industrial production pottery that had a significant presence from the 1920s to the 1980s, with subsequent enterprises being far smaller in scale. We have studio pottery that dominated the ceramic scene from the 1950s to the 1990s, after which it's waned significantly. In the next phase, we had, something happened there. Next phase, we have ceramic art. It made its debut in South Africa in the mid-1960s, progressively gaining in prominence and is the current dominant idiom. And that, in a nutshell, is the history of South African ceramics, previous century and this century. But what lies obscured, and in many cases undocumented, is the what and the how of role players and agencies that influenced the development and progression of our ceramics. I'm not speaking of a linear progression, I'm speaking of a consequential evolution which ties in with what the Africanist art historian John Picton wrote, namely, that's another one. I get so taken up by what I'm telling you. I forget to show the slide. So if you get bored, just remind me to show you a slide. And this is what John Picton said. Namely, that we bear knowledge of the manner in which artists do or do not draw upon a sense of tradition and or on the forms of particular traditions, the manner in which artists interpret the past in the context of the present concerns, the facts and circumstances of a demise of traditions of visual practice and the birth of others, and the complex factors which enable and or govern these possibilities. Now, I'm going to apply Picton's dictum to just one feature of South African ceramics, namely the use of hybridity to interrogate, position, and present a presence and persona in a multicultural society. In South African ceramics of the 20th and the 21st centuries, there is ample evidence of an innovative blending of Western and African ceramic traditions, techniques, and materials. And we can draw a comparison with African modernism in the manner that South African ceramists challenged Western ceramic conventions. This is a piece by Anatsulu in its binaries of the art craft and imposed identities. African modernism was spearheaded by a group of Nigerian artists in the mid-1960s at the time of the independence of the African nations. And their works became linked to an expression of self-awareness, taking into account culture and tradition, but not being constrained by their culture and traditions. That opened the door for hybridity. It, not only in the borrowing from others' forms and features, but also in the choice of their materials, their processes, their techniques, and technology. In fact, hybridity became a hallmark feature of African modernism. There was no similar formal movement copying African modernism in South Africa, but we can see echoes of that in the manner that the ceramists, let me show two more. This is African modernism examples here. And there's another one. This is by Rashid Koraichi from Sudan. Absolutely amazing. And you can see that he used some Islamic elements in the porcelain work there. So in South Africa, we see a blending of cultural references as the ceramists started expressing their indigeneity, how they fit into a multicultural society, with colonial and post-colonial histories. Now this involved the interrogation of such issues as place, tradition, culture, history, circumstance, relationship, identity. There are four considerations when we speak of hybridity. The reflection of an own culture, the inquiry of different cultures, exploring commonalities between those cultures, and then evolving a visual language in which to express that. I'm going to illustrate that with some examples of past and contemporary ceramics. The favoring of Western-style ceramics in the 2 decades after World War II was very reflective of the character of the minority of the white South African society, enjoying political, economic, and cultural domination under the nationalist government. In the shadow of that stood the traditional forms of pottery, produced by indigenous Black South African cultures, and those works at that time were then at best considered as collectible ethnographic material culture. The Western perception of the other, meaning the non-Western, was embedded and transmitted in works produced by a number of South African production potteries. An example of this is this decorative plate. Sorry, that's another one, traditional cultural work. Here's an example of a perception of the other, a plate produced by the Kalahari West studio. Now, it very specifically tapped into the demand for products that portrayed indigenous culture and social life. And it's a romanticized or a distorted imagery of native life. And Wendiger stated it reflected a preference for unspoiled tribal images, exotic, beautiful, naked or semi-naked black women, crass sketches of African and pseudo-African culture. Now, apart from the fact that this is a gross misrepresentation of the other, this is also blatant cultural appropriation. Studio pottery, which gained its foothold in South Africa in the 1960s, 50s, 60s and after, attracted a large number of practitioners and followers. And they called on, to some degree, the ethics and the aesthetics of the Anglo-Oriental tradition. I'm not going to teach you about the Anglo-Oriental tradition. Also, in evidence amongst those early practitioners were the influences of the Scandinavian and the Japanese schools of pottery. Some of them, there's the Japanese influence, but some of them alluded to the association with South Africa or Africa in the imagery and the colors and the textures, but nothing specific aimed saying, I am Africa or South Africa. Going on to Rockstrip, contemporaneous with those first generations of potters, a group of black women skilled in the handmaking of traditional vessels were recruited by the Evangelical Lutheran Church's Art and Craft Workshop at Rockstrip. And they were guided by Nordic instructions. I'm pressing the wrong button. There's another example there. To produce wares specifically to appeal to the Western market. Now, instead of coiling and pit firing, these were produced in a modern studio with modern studio technology, differing materials, differing glazes, and the resultant works record the traditional forms, but the notably novel features gave them immediate appeal to collectors, both within and outside of South Africa. So we can actually think of Rockstrip pottery as the first true examples of hybridity in South African ceramics. The next generation of ceramic artists from the 1970s, the majority of them white, many of them trained at tertiary level, abandoned Western convention. And the reason is very interesting. Andrew Verstappen, the art critic and artist, posed this question: why are we abandoning Western tradition? Through all our art has been a thread that has troubled people to a greater or lesser extent, the one of belonging. Where do we fit as artists into Africa? How to prove our credentials? How do we resolve the dilemma of being Western and African at the same time? Authenticity is everything, but identity has been elusive, is elusive, and cannot be invented. The secret is in the way the ideas are used. The secret lies in the imagination of the artist. The opportunity to do that came in the form of the vessel. It's not bound by any tradition or conventions, whether in form, decoration, purpose, associated with the pot. It's a metaphor for the pot, and assumes the function of being a container for concepts. And that permitted South African ceramists to explore and express a personal and creative identity. Traditional pot most frequently referenced by black and white ceramists is a beer vessel, or kamba. The brewing, serving, and drinking of sorghum beer represent a relationship with ancestor spirits, but also embodies concepts of social propriety and etiquette. And then, just back to that slide, everybody is familiar with the Amasumpa features, and that will be prominent in what I'm saying next. The reimagining of cultural forms like this is evident. So here's another interpretation thereof. This is by Maggie Mukula, Michel Lake, Ian Garrett. These ceramists as examples, and many others, called in a judicious manner on the physical and symbolic features of traditional material culture, but importantly, also the cultural and socio-political context of traditional production and usage. The reimagining of cultural forms is evident in the works of contemporary black ceramists like Tauda Tuli and Andile Diabane. Tuli produces forms that reflect his Nguni culture. He alters the shape and the size of traditional vessels, forms to make them meaningless as utilitarian vessels, but metaphysically and ideologically meaningful. The surface decorations can be a play on traditional geometric patterns, or in a break of tradition, he introduces drawings, writings, and marks of personal iconography. The marks might be his reference to ritualistic body incisions or scarification. And that, in Nguni belief, establishes the link between the living and the ancestral dead. And then he goes a step further. Here's a close-up of that vessel. He goes a step further, and he names the vessel, which is not a cultural practice. And it gives them provocative titles like miseducation, blackout through whitewash, or stolen legacy. Andile's work reflects a metropolitan persona and his strong ties to his culture. His works bridge traditional material culture and urban design concepts very much to appeal to an international audience. And this is evident in his Idonga collection. One of these, this is part of that collection. Idonga, Donga, soil erosion. So if you look at the vessel, the form resembles a slippery slope, the neck recalling a cattle hoof print in mud. Those of you who grew up on a farm would know exactly what it is and recognize it. And then it's decorated with very faint lines to evoke scarification, a multitude of letters. They don't form words at all. Seen in the whole, the vessel recalls an African legacy, dark, textured earth, scarification, but then also emerging with the modern, the other, Western technology and Roman lettering. Cattle and their associated political, social, and cultural meanings have also been presented in South African ceramics, whether in realistic or abstracted or symbolic manner. Ceramist Juliet Armstrong established both a personal identity and a broader South African narrative in her series of work in bone china, such as this, Flies in the Mill. This is a prime example of that. It references the Zulu protection apron that a mother would wear on the birth of her first child. And in the case of Juliet, at that time, she was taking care of a very elderly, very frail mother. And it became a personal, visual, and symbolic reference for her own care of her frail mother, and the engagement with the more universal theme of protecting others from aging and illness. Nicoline Swanepoel also referred to cattle heads, created a series of 70 of them to establish the historical, economic, and social role of cattle in black culture, but also as a metaphor of the protracted struggle for the recognition of black identity. She applied variations of color and pattern with transferred images onto the heads to reflect South African history from the earliest colonial times to the national era. You can see the VOC mark on the nose. In a series of works that referenced ear tags used to identify cattle, Kim Bagley addressed the theme of group dynamics and values, including that of identification, movement, and interaction. But it also recalled the apartheid-era use of the dompas, used to restrict the mobility of black people and a means to enforce racial segregation. Now, with these few examples, and there are many more, I have tried to illustrate that cultural referencing has not been a mere sampling of one another's tradition, identities, and histories. Wilma Kruse stated The ethnic and culturally diverse South African society offers multiple symbolic references and multiple histories with which to create and support a space in which a common heritage can be negotiated. And the outcome of that, as I've shown, is a rich and meaningful ceramics visual language in which we can read how South African ceramists interrogate and express both individuality and commonality. To wrap up, in South African ceramics we know the following: that tradition and conventions are not treated as monolithic abstractions, that forms and the associated values and meanings can be adopted and adapted, that ceramists have the agency to interrogate and communicate concepts inclusive of what constitutes an expanded personal and common identity against the backdrop of a contested space in history, that the resultant visual language is rich in reference, meaning, respect, and integrity. To conclude, the message I want to drive home is that when we consider works merely on the basis of their aesthetic values, it appreciates the context of their becoming. If we have the knowledge and the understanding of context, it transforms the ceramic works from being mere objects into subjects. And then it becomes a contextual narrative of entanglement of the ceramist with materials, circumstances, influences, but at the same time an extended contextual narrative of how we, as non-ceramists, engage with the works of ceramics. That's for the lecture, and might be more boring than what I have to say to you now. I sit far away. 10-hour time difference at this stage. It's difficult for me as a South African ceramics art historian sitting on the other side of the world to research, interview, gather data with South African ceramists, because there are no documented, or very little that is documented and available online or in print. All I see, good photographs of pretty pots on Instagram. It is the most annoying thing ever. There are no measurements. There are no titles if a work has a title. Nothing about the materials or the processes. Nothing about the concept that you are pursuing. It's just a picture of a pretty pot. It's fine, you're still alive, I can still phone or email and nag you for information. 10 years from now, I'm not going to be around. The next generation of academics are going to be so frustrated, they don't know what you are busy doing. What are you creating? What are the influence? What was the starting point? What is the end point? You need a ceramist, irrespective of what level of achievement you are at. You need to document what you are doing. Artist statements, descriptions, measurements, materials, techniques. Please, you are writing yourself out of history if you do not document this. Good Afrikaans expression, julle sit die pot mis. Do you understand what it means? Julle sit die pot mis if you are not creating a text foundation for your work. Please, I urge you to do that. If you want to be part of the history, ceramics, art history of the future, do it. Otherwise, you have no relevance. Questions, you're welcome. So, no tomatoes being thrown in? The lecture, this is how, from an academic point of view, we present what you are, what you have achieved. Want to make it understandable, but to place it in context. And there are many different contexts in which we approach ceramic works. This is but one feature thereof. And as you can see, the more data we have, the better we can pull out and draw together the strands to create a narrative. You are creating ceramic works. If you're only creating objects, then they will stay objects. If you give a substance, the buyer, or even non-buyers, people just merely being interested in your work, if you give us a substance, then your pot, your vessel, becomes a subject. Something that I can relate to, and someone else would relate to it very differently. And that is how the narrative starts, and how we can keep on creating the narrative. I hope that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.